May 8, 1942. Coral Sea, Southwest Pacific. The flight deck is slick with fuel and seawater, the air sharp with smoke and cordite. Below decks, the USS Yorktown shudders as another bomb detonates somewhere deep in her steel frame. Lights flicker. Men stumble. Somewhere aft, a voice shouts that flooding is spreading faster than expected. For Lieutenant Commander William Bull Halsey Jr.'s airmen circling overhead, the sight is sickening. Their carrier, the heart of their world, is burning. On the bridge, Captain Elliot Buckmaster grips the railing, jaw clenched, eyes fixed forward. He has already ordered damage control parties into compartments that feel more like furnaces than rooms. Steam hisses. Fire roars. The smell of burned paint and aviation fuel clings to everything. Yorktown has been hit hard. Not fatally, perhaps, but badly enough that no one aboard doubts the verdict Japanese planners will soon reach. She is finished, or so it seems. The Battle of the Coral Sea ends not with a decisive clash of fleets, but with absence. The Japanese invasion force, bound for Port Moresby, turns back. Strategically, the battle favors the Allies. Tactically, it is a brutal draw. The U.S. Navy loses the carrier Lexington. The Yorktown survives. Barely, her flight deck cratered, her hull warped, her crew exhausted and bloodied. In the chaos of the Pacific War's early months, survival itself feels like victory. But survival is not the same as readiness. As Yorktown limps away from the Coral Sea, escorted by cruisers and destroyers, the prevailing assumption on both sides of the conflict is simple. Whatever remains of her fighting capability is measured in weeks, not days. She will need extensive yard time. Dry dock. A pause. The Japanese are certain of it. So are many Americans, yet the war is moving too fast for certainty. 3,000 miles away, in Pearl Harbor, Admiral Chester W. Nimitz stands in his headquarters, studying intelligence reports that feel almost unbelievable. Radio intercepts suggest the Japanese combined fleet is preparing something vague, something decisive. A strike aimed not south, but east. Midway. If the Japanese take Midway, they gain a forward base that threatens Hawaii itself. Worse, they may draw out the remaining American carriers and destroy them in one annihilating blow. Nimitz counts what he has: Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown. He pauses on the last name. On paper, Yorktown should not be here, not in any meaningful way. She is damaged, her air group depleted, her machinery stressed beyond peacetime tolerances. Every conventional calculation says she should be sidelined. But Nimitz has learned, painfully, that this war will not reward conventional thinking. He sends a message to Pearl Harbor Naval Shipyard that sounds less like an order and more like a challenge. How fast can you fix her? When Yorktown arrives at Pearl on May the 27th, the dockyard workers stare in silence. The carrier looks worse than many had imagined. Plates are buckled. The flight deck is scarred and sagging. Internal systems are jury-rigged. To anyone accustomed to peacetime standards, this is a ship that needs months. Nimitz gives them 3 days, 72 hours. No extensions, no excuses. What follows is not repair in the traditional sense. It is triage, a calculated gamble that accepts imperfection in exchange for presence. More than 1,000 shipyard workers swarm aboard Yorktown. Welders spark through the night. Electricians splice cables by feel. Damaged compartments are patched, not restored. Elevators are coaxed back into partial function. Engines are pushed to limits they were never designed to endure. Men sleep where they fall. Time ceases to exist as anything other than a countdown. Aviation crews quietly rebuild an air group that, on paper, should not exist. Replacement pilots arrive from scattered units. Planes are transferred from other carriers. Squadron markings are repainted hastily, sometimes still tacky when aircraft roll onto the deck. The ship is not made perfect. She is made usable, and that distinction will matter more than anyone yet realizes. On May 30th, USS Yorktown leaves Pearl Harbor under her own power. She does not look ready. But she sails anyway. Out across the Pacific, Japanese naval planners finalize their own calculations. The Americans, they believe, have 2 carriers available at most. Yorktown was damaged at Coral Sea, possibly sunk, certainly out of action. The math is clean. The odds are overwhelming. Confidence settles over the combined fleet like a blanket. They have no idea that a carrier they have already written off is steaming toward Midway at full speed, patched, scarred, and very much alive. June 3rd, 1942, North Pacific, east of Midway Atoll. North Pacific, east of Midway Atoll. The ocean is calm in a way that feels unnatural. A vast, glassy blue, broken only by the white wakes of warships cutting westward in disciplined formation. On the bridge of USS Yorktown, Captain Elliot Buckmaster watches the horizon through binoculars, his face giving nothing away. The carrier hums beneath his feet, not smoothly, not comfortably, but she holds together. Below decks, damage control crews remain at near constant readiness. Temporary patches sweat under pressure. Pumps run continuously. Engineers listen to machinery like doctors monitoring a feverish patient, alert for any change in rhythm that might mean catastrophe. Yorktown is not healed. She is being held together by will, and yet to the men aboard her flight deck, that distinction hardly matters. Aircraft are spotted for launch. Fuel lines are connected. Ordnance crews move with the practiced efficiency of people who know exactly how little margin they have left. This is not a ship returning from the dead. This is a ship refusing to acknowledge death at all. At Midway, U.S. Navy PBY Catalina patrol planes report sightings of Japanese ships approaching from the northwest. The long-anticipated blow is coming. Admiral Nimitz's gamble is about to be tested. Aboard the Japanese flagship Akagi, Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo studies his own reports with quiet confidence. His force is overwhelming. 4 fleet carriers, battleships, cruisers, destroyers. The Americans, by every calculation available to Japanese intelligence, can muster no more than 2 operational carriers. That assumption shapes everything. Nagumo plans accordingly. His carrier air groups are rotated with an economy that reflects numerical superiority. His defensive screens are arranged with the expectation that any American response will be limited. Desperate, perhaps, but manageable. Nowhere in his planning is there room for a 3rd American carrier. Certainly not Yorktown. At dawn on June 4th, Yorktown's flight deck erupts into motion. Engines roar. Propellers blur. SBD Dauntless dive bombers roll forward and leap into the air, climbing hard into the pale morning sky. Torpedo bombers follow, their crews acutely aware that they are flying into one of the most heavily defended carrier formations in the world. Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie, leading Yorktown's dive bombers, glances down at the carrier shrinking beneath him. He knows what the ship endured only days earlier. He also knows what it means that she is here now. It means the enemy is wrong. The American attack unfolds in brutal, disjointed fashion. Torpedo squadrons from Hornet, Enterprise, and Yorktown are slaughtered almost to the man, flying low and slow into walls of anti-aircraft fire and 0 fighters. Planes vanish into the sea in flames. Radio calls cut off mid-sentence. From the Japanese perspective, This is confirmation of expectation. The Americans are reckless, outnumbered, throwing lives away in piecemeal attacks. Nagumo believes he is winning. Then the dive bombers arrive. High above the Japanese fleet, American SBDs suddenly break through the cloud layer. Not in one coordinated wave, but in fragments arriving almost simultaneously from different directions. The timing is accidental. The effect is catastrophic. On Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, decks are crowded with aircraft being refueled and rearmed. Bombs and torpedoes lie exposed. Fuel hoses snake across planking. The Japanese carriers are at their most vulnerable. From Yorktown's squadrons, bombs fall with horrifying precision. Explosions tear through the hangar decks. Fires spread instantly, fed by aviation fuel and stacked munitions. Within minutes, 3 of Japan's 4 fleet carriers are burning beyond hope of recovery. On Yorktown, men cheer, briefly, then return to work. There is no time to celebrate. The battle is not finished. And then something happens that sends a ripple of disbelief through Japanese command channels. A counterstrike forms. Japanese aircraft, scrambled from the surviving carrier Hiryu, race toward the American fleet. Their pilots expect to find 2 carriers. They find 3. When the first bombs slam into Yorktown's deck shortly after noon, the shock aboard the Japanese planes is almost as severe as the physical impact on the ship itself. Smoke erupts. The carrier shudders again, eerily reminiscent of Coral Sea. But Yorktown does not die. Damage control teams move instantly. Fires are contained. Power is restored. Within an hour, the carrier appears, incredibly, operational again. Japanese pilots report in disbelief. Enemy carrier repaired, still operating. The message spreads through the Japanese command like a cold wave. How is this possible? The ship was supposed to be destroyed weeks ago. Even if not sunk, she should be out of the fight. Instead, she is absorbing punishment and continuing. A second Japanese strike arrives. Torpedoes slam into Yorktown's hull. This time, the damage is too severe. She lists heavily. Buckmaster orders abandon ship, but the damage has already done its work. Yorktown has fulfilled her purpose. She has existed. She has forced the Japanese to divide their attention, split their strikes, and waste precious time and aircraft hunting a carrier they believed should not be there at all. She has distorted their operational picture at the worst possible moment. And in war, distortion kills. As the smoke clears over the Pacific that evening, Japanese commanders begin to understand the scale of what has happened. Their carrier force, the core of their naval power, has been shattered in a single day, and part of that catastrophe traces back to an assumption that now lies in ruins, that ships once damaged are finished. USS Yorktown proved otherwise. June 4th, 1942. Aboard the Japanese carrier Hiryu, Vice Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi stands on the bridge, hands clasped behind his back, staring at the smoke on the horizon. 3 carriers are already gone. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu. Burning wrecks scattered across what had been, only hours earlier, the most powerful naval striking force on Earth. Hiryu remains, and so does hope. Yamaguchi is not a man given to illusion. He understands the gravity of the moment with painful clarity. The First Air Fleet has taken a blow that cannot be undone, but it is not yet finished. American carriers still operate somewhere to the east. Destroying them is no longer merely tactical. It is existential. Reports from returning pilots are confusing, contradictory, and deeply unsettling. They describe 3 American carriers, not 2. 3. Yamaguchi demands clarification. Signals officers recheck intercepts. Intelligence officers sift through hurried combat reports. Slowly, reluctantly, the truth emerges. One of the carriers struck earlier is still alive. The name reaches him like a ghost. Yorktown. Yamaguchi knows the ship. He knows the battle at Coral Sea. He knows the damage reported. Flight deck hits, internal flooding, heavy casualties. In Japanese naval doctrine, that should have ended her role in the war. Ships do not return from that. Yet here she is, operational, fighting, absorbing punishment that should have killed her twice. Yamaguchi does not waste time arguing with reality. He orders a final, desperate counterstrike. Every remaining aircraft on Hiryu is launched, dive bombers and torpedo planes alike, aimed at the American carriers before they can regroup. The pilots know what this is, not a raid, a last blow. They find Yorktown again, listing but still afloat, her deck scarred and blackened. Torpedoes strike. Flooding spreads uncontrollably. This time there is no recovery. Captain Buckmaster gives the order no captain ever wants to give. Abandon ship. As sailors slide down lines into the water, Yorktown settles into the Pacific, wounded but defiant to the end. She does not sink immediately. She lingers, stubborn even in death. But her work is already complete. American dive bombers soon find Hiryu. Bombs hit home. Fires rage. Yamaguchi chooses to go down with his ship. By nightfall, the last carrier of the First Air Fleet is finished. The Battle of Midway is over. In Tokyo, the initial reports are fragmented, sanitized, incomplete. Losses are acknowledged cautiously. Language is softened. But within the Imperial Japanese Navy's inner circles, the magnitude of the disaster becomes impossible to hide. 4 fleet carriers lost. Hundreds of elite pilots dead. Years of training erased in a single day. And at the center of the catastrophe lies a miscalculation so basic, so deeply ingrained, that no one had thought to question it. That damaged ships do not return. Japanese naval planning had been built on decisive battle theory, the idea that fleets clash, losses are inflicted, and the balance shifts permanently. Attrition is meaningful because replacement is slow, difficult, and uncertain. This logic had worked against Russia in 1905, against China, against the Western colonial navies in the early days of the Pacific War. But America is not a naval power built on scarcity. It is built on repair, on redundancy, on the assumption that damage is not defeat. At Pearl Harbor, Japanese planners had believed they crippled the U.S. Pacific Fleet for years. Instead, they triggered an industrial mobilization unlike anything the world had seen. At Coral Sea, they believed they removed Yorktown from the war. Instead, they forced American dockyards to prove a concept Japan did not fully understand. That speed of recovery matters as much as initial strength. 72 hours. That is what shattered an empire's expectations. Because Yorktown's return was not simply a feat of engineering. It was a philosophical statement, one the Japanese Navy was not structured to answer. Japanese carriers were masterpieces, complex, carefully crafted, dependent on skilled labor and long repair cycles. American carriers were platforms, modular, standardized, designed to be patched, fixed, and returned to service under pressure. When Yorktown appeared at Midway, she did more than add another flight deck to the American order of battle. She lied. She told the enemy a false story about American capacity. She made Japanese commanders believe they were facing a fleet smaller than it truly was, and slower to recover than it actually could. And that lie shaped every decision that followed. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto would later reflect bitterly on the outcome. He had warned that Japan could not win a long war against American industry. He had sought decisive blows to force negotiation. Midway was meant to be the last such blow. Instead, it revealed the truth too clearly to ignore. America did not need to avoid loss. It needed to absorb it. USS Yorktown embodied that reality. Patched, scarred, half repaired and still lethal. When she finally slipped beneath the waves days later, torpedoed by a Japanese submarine, she carried with her a lesson that would define the rest of the Pacific War. The enemy could destroy American ships, but they could not destroy America's ability to replace them, or its willingness to send them back into battle before the paint was dry. And once that realization took hold inside Japanese Naval Command, something fundamental changed. They were no longer fighting ships, they were fighting time. June 6, 1942, Tokyo Naval Ministry. The room is quiet in a way that feels unnatural. Not the tense quiet of anticipation, but the hollow quiet that follows shock. Senior officers sit rigidly around the long table as updated reports from Midway are read aloud, one after another, each confirming what none of them want to say openly. The First Air Fleet is gone. Not damaged. Not bloodied. Gone. Rear Admiral Shigeru Fukudome listens without expression. But inside, the implications spiral rapidly beyond the immediate loss. He has spent years studying American naval doctrine, shipbuilding capacity, training pipelines. He understands numbers. He understands replacement rates. And now, one number eclipses all others. 72 hours, that is how long it took the Americans to bring Yorktown back. Not to perfect condition. Not to peacetime standards. Just enough. Enough to fly planes. Enough to launch strikes. Enough to be counted as a carrier when Japanese planners believed they were facing only 2. That margin, one flight deck, is the difference between victory and annihilation at Midway. The realization is corrosive. Japanese war planning had always assumed that damage removed ships from the order of battle for extended periods. Repairs required dockyards, skilled artisans, time measured in months. Losses mattered because they were permanent. American planning, Fukudome now sees, assumes something else entirely. That damage is temporary. That time is compressible. That a ship does not need to be perfect to be lethal. Across the Pacific, the United States Navy absorbs Midway in a very different way. There is relief, yes. Jubilation in some quarters. But in Pearl Harbor, no one forgets how close the margin truly was. Admiral Chester Nimitz reads the after-action reports with a technician's eye, noting not just what succeeded, but what barely held together. Yorktown's pumps failing, damage control teams improvising with wooden beams and canvas, aircraft crews launching from a deck still stained with coral sea blood. This is not triumph, it is validation. Validation of a philosophy Nimitz and his logistics officers have been quietly refining since December 1941. That the war will be won not by preserving ships, but by cycling them. Repair forward. Patch quickly. Return immediately. Perfection can wait. Availability cannot. The lesson spreads fast. By late 1942, American carrier doctrine evolves visibly. Damage control training intensifies. Spare parts inventories expand. Dockyard processes are streamlined ruthlessly. Crews drill not just for combat, but for recovery. A carrier that survives a hit is no longer considered out of action. It is considered next in line. Japanese naval intelligence notices the change, but lacks the industrial leverage to respond in kind. Shipyards are already strained. Skilled labor is finite. Materials are scarce. Every repair competes with new construction, and neither proceeds quickly enough. And more troubling still, pilot losses at Midway cannot be replaced. Japan's carrier air groups had been elite, hand-selected, carefully trained, irreplaceable. Midway destroys not just aircraft, but experience accumulated over a decade. America, by contrast, accelerates pilot production aggressively. Training is standardized. Losses are expected. Replacements are continuous. The asymmetry widens. In early 1943, a Japanese staff officer writes a private memorandum that will never be published. The enemy repairs ships faster than we assess damage. Our intelligence cycle cannot keep pace with their recovery. It is a quiet admission of strategic blindness, because intelligence that cannot account for rapid repair is worse than useless. It lies. USS Yorktown becomes more than a ship in American memory. She becomes a symbol used internally, not for propaganda posters, but for planners, engineers, and commanders shaping the next phase of the war. Her story is taught at staff colleges, not as heroism, as process. A damaged carrier that returns in 3 days is not a miracle. It is the result of doctrine, preparation, and the willingness to accept imperfection. As 1943 turns into 1944, new American carriers arrive in numbers that dwarf pre-war fleets. Essex-class ships, larger, tougher, designed explicitly with lessons from Yorktown's ordeal in mind. Their layouts emphasize damage control. Their systems are redundant. Their construction anticipates loss. Japan cannot match this pace. By the time American forces advance across the Central Pacific, Gilbert Islands, Marshalls, Marianas, the outcome is no longer uncertain inside Japanese naval command. They continue to fight, fiercely and skillfully, but the war has shifted from decisive battles to delaying actions. The return of Yorktown marked that shift, not because she won Midway alone, but because she proved something irreversible. That America does not need to avoid disaster. It needs to recover faster than disaster can compound. When Japanese pilots later face American carrier groups that seem to regenerate overnight, decks repaired, squadrons replenished, hulls patched, the sense of inevitability deepens. They destroy ships, and new ones appear. They inflict damage, and damaged ships return. Midway was not the moment Japan lost the war, but it was the moment Japan learned, too late, that it was fighting an enemy whose greatest weapon was not firepower. It was resilience engineered at scale, and that weapon could not be sunk. July 1942, Pearl Harbor Navy Yard. The dry dock where Yorktown briefly rested is already busy again. New carriers arrive scarred from Guadalcanal. Destroyers with buckled hulls queue for patchwork repairs. The yard operates in perpetual motion. Cranes swinging, torches hissing, sailors and civilian workers moving shoulder to shoulder in shifts that blur day and night. There is no ceremony attached to Yorktown now. She is gone. Torpedoed by the Japanese submarine I-168 on June 6th, hours after Midway was effectively decided, she rolled slowly to port and slipped beneath the waves. The loss is recorded, mourned briefly, and then absorbed. But among American naval planners, Yorktown's influence only grows stronger after her sinking, because her true contribution to the war was never survival. It was interruption. She interrupted Japanese certainty. She interrupted assumptions about time, damage, and recovery. And in doing so, she forced the enemy to fight a war of uncertainty they were not equipped to win. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto studies post-Midway assessments in the weeks that follow, searching for a flaw that can be corrected. Tactics can be revised. Carrier formations adjusted. Pilot training accelerated, at least on paper. But one thing cannot be fixed. Japanese intelligence had assessed Yorktown as destroyed. They had been right. By conventional standards, she was burning, flooded, structurally damaged. Any Japanese carrier in that condition would have been unavailable for months. But American standards are no longer conventional. That mismatch between what damage means to each navy is now the central fault line of the Pacific War. At Guadalcanal, later that year, Japanese commanders repeatedly report American naval forces that should not exist. Carriers appearing days after engagements. Cruisers rejoining action with visible scars. Destroyers patched, repainted, rearmed, and back on station. They suspect deception. They suspect exaggeration. They never suspect the truth, that American naval logistics has been re-engineered around speed of return, not preservation. Every battle reinforces the lesson first learned at Midway. Sink a ship, and the Americans respond by sending 2 more. Damage a carrier, and it returns before your reports reach headquarters. The psychological effect is corrosive. Japanese officers begin to describe American fleets as elastic, stretching under pressure, snapping back into shape before decisive advantage can be exploited. Elasticity is not something Japanese doctrine values. Their naval tradition emphasizes decisive engagements, carefully prepared, executed with precision, and concluded with clear outcomes. America refuses to conclude. It absorbs. Back in Washington, Navy planners formalize what Yorktown proved in practice. Repair timelines are treated as weapons. Forward bases are expanded. Floating dry docks are towed across the Pacific like mobile arteries. A ship no longer needs to return home. Home follows the ship. Damage control manuals are rewritten based on lessons learned aboard Yorktown. Fire suppression, compartmentalization, emergency flight deck repairs, all emphasized with one overriding principle. Get back into the fight, even if incomplete, even if ugly, even if vulnerable, because presence matters more than perfection. By 1943, American carrier task forces operate with a tempo that feels impossible to Japanese observers. Fast carriers rotate in and out of action seamlessly. Air groups are replenished, pilots replaced, deck crews swapped. Losses still occur. They are simply anticipated, planned for, accounted for. The war no longer pivots on singular moments of destruction. It pivots on throughput, and that concept, throughput, is alien to Japanese naval culture, which has always viewed ships as capital investments to be protected, not cycled. The tragedy is not that Japan fails to understand this intellectually. Some officers do. The tragedy is that Japan lacks the industrial depth, labor flexibility, and logistical freedom to act on it, even if it wanted to. By the time the US Navy launches its great carrier offensives in 1944, the Philippine Sea, later Gulf, the outcome is foregone. Japanese pilots face fleets that regenerate faster than they can be depleted. American losses sting, but do not cripple. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot is not simply an air battle. It is the culmination of a philosophy first demonstrated when Yorktown returned from Coral Sea. That ships exist to be used. That damage is temporary. That time can be compressed if you design for it. After the war, Japanese officers interviewed by Allied analysts repeatedly return to the same moment. Not Pearl Harbor, not Midway itself, but the realization that Yorktown had been present at all. We believed we were fighting 2 carriers, one officer admits. We were fighting 3. That error was not tactical. It was existential. Because once an enemy can erase the consequences of damage faster than you can exploit them, the war ceases to be about striking power. It becomes about endurance. USS Yorktown did not win Midway by surviving. She won it by refusing to stay gone. And in doing so, she revealed the future of naval warfare. A future where victory belongs not to the fleet that avoids loss, but to the one that plans for it. May 1945, Tokyo Bay. The war ends not with a battle, but with silence. Japanese naval officers stand on the deck of the battleship Missouri, uniforms pressed, faces unreadable as the surrender documents are signed. Around them floats the largest armada ever assembled. Carriers, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, auxiliaries. An oceanic presence so overwhelming it barely registers as spectacle anymore. It simply exists. For men like Captain Sadatoshi Tomioka, once a planner in the combined fleet staff, the defeat has long since stopped feeling sudden. It feels cumulative. After the ceremony, Allied intelligence officers begin the long process of interviews. Questions are asked about Pearl Harbor, Midway, Guadalcanal, later. About doctrine. About pilots. About fuel shortages and industrial bottlenecks. And again, the conversation circles back to one moment, May 1942, the appearance of Yorktown at Midway. Tomioka admits it plainly. "We believe the Americans had lost 1/3 of their carrier strength," he says. "Our entire plan assumed it." The interviewer asks the obvious follow-up. "And when Yorktown appeared?" Tomioka pauses. "It meant," he says slowly, "that our assumptions about time were wrong." That single sentence captures the heart of the Pacific War. Japan fought as if time was scarce, brittle, decisive. America fought as if time could be engineered. The difference was not courage. It was structure. USS Yorktown embodied that structure before anyone fully understood it. Her 72-hour resurrection at Pearl Harbor was not a miracle. It was a preview of floating dry docks that would follow fleets across oceans, of Seabees carving airstrips out of coral in days, of replacement pilots arriving faster than losses could teach lessons, of ships built, damaged, repaired, and returned in cycles too fast for enemy intelligence to track. To Japanese planners, Yorktown's return felt supernatural. To American planners, it was a proof of concept. After Midway, the U.S. Navy does not ask, "Can we prevent losses?" It asks, "How quickly can we absorb them?" That shift changes everything. By 1943, American carriers are no longer treated as irreplaceable treasures. They are platforms. Vital, yes, but part of a system designed to continue operating even when individual components fail. That mindset terrifies opponents, because it means there is no single blow that ends the war, no knockout punch, no decisive strike that freezes momentum. You can burn a flight deck, you can flood compartments, you can sink a ship, and the system keeps moving. This is why Midway matters beyond tactics. Because Midway proves that destruction alone is insufficient against an enemy who has mastered recovery. The Japanese Navy excelled at dealing damage. The U.S. Navy excelled at erasing its consequences. That asymmetry widens with every month. At the Philippine Sea, Japanese aviators are lost in numbers that cannot be replaced. At Leyte Gulf, Japanese ships are committed despite knowing they cannot be repaired afterward. Every engagement is final, every mistake permanent. Meanwhile, American task forces rotate, refit, and return. Scars visible, efficiency intact. After the war, U.S. naval analysts study Yorktown not as a heroic sacrifice, but as an operational turning point. Damage control training, forward repair doctrine, industrial integration, all traced back to lessons crystallized in May 1942. One report summarizes it succinctly. USS Yorktown demonstrated that the decisive factor in modern naval warfare is not survival, but speed of return to action. That idea extends far beyond aircraft carriers. It shapes how America fights wars for the rest of the century. In Korea, in Vietnam, in the Cold War. Systems are designed not to be indestructible, but to be resilient, replaceable, scalable. Because resilience breaks the enemy's ability to predict outcomes, and prediction is how wars are planned. Japanese officers did not lose confidence because Yorktown fought well. They lost confidence because Yorktown violated the timeline. She was supposed to be gone. Instead, she was overhead, launching aircraft, killing carriers, shattering assumptions. USS Yorktown sank less than a month later. But by then, the damage was done. Not to Japanese hulls, but to Japanese certainty. The war would go on for 3 more brutal years. But its direction had already shifted, not because America avoided loss, but because it learned how to make loss irrelevant. That is why Yorktown matters. Not as a ghost ship, not as a miracle, but as the moment the Imperial Japanese Navy realized, too late, that it was not fighting ships. It was fighting time itself. And time, once engineered, is the deadliest weapon of all.